This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 85 of the Construction Record podcast. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today. And with me from the West Coast is...
Digital Media Editor of the Journal of Commerce, Warren Frey.
Hey, Warren, so here we are again, yet another podcast from our bunkers.
Yes, indeed, our separate bunkers.
Yeah, separate bunkers. We're, I know the joke starts to get old at some point, right? That we're so physically distanced.
Has it though?
Yeah, but has it really? I think we got still a few months of this.
Well, the pandemic's getting a little old, but that doesn't mean it's not still sticking around. So.
No, I know. Yeah, regardless of how everybody wants to open up the economies.
Don't even get me started. I'm going to shelter in place until I know I'm fine, and I don't think I'm fine yet. So here we are.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at the context of our industry too, like I know that's not the focus of our podcast chat today, but stuff really never stopped, right?
No, it did not.
No, people recalibrated. There were slight pauses here in Ontario. Obviously, Quebec, there was the bigger shutdown, but in BC primarily, everything seemed to be rolling forward just fine, right?
I mean, Bonnie Henry was actually profiled a couple of days ago in New York Times as an example of what to do right and how to go about doing it. Now, she wasn't draconian. She basically said, "Hey, everybody, it's in your best interest to do this," and people did it. So, not to get on my high horse because we could flare up tomorrow, but BC's been doing okay, and that's probably part of why. Mostly because we have Washington State to get scared of at a time. I think that might have helped.
Well, for sure. Yeah, it was right on your doorstep right there. And Bonnie Henry was like front and center way back during the SARS outbreak as well. Yeah. So, and I think in the future there will be that case study about the certain chief medical health officers that really excelled.
Yeah, and honestly, political leadership too, because in Canada, not all Canada. Quebec didn't do this, but Ontario did, and BC certainly did, and I think Alberta did. They just kind of stepped to one side and said, "Okay, medical guys, you know what you're doing, you do it," and that worked, I think.
Completely. And the track record of a lot of those medical health officers, they all seem to have been tied back to some sort of frontline organizational, most that seemed that was experience with the SARS outbreak.
You know what I mean? Too, in Bonnie Henry's case, I believe.
Yes, exactly. So lessons learned and reapplied really well, right? Just some, but as we said, that's not for this podcast, but still interesting to reflect all the same. But it's not over. And I know with our industry too, yes, economies are opening up, and now's the busy season for construction across Canada. The question is when potentially that second wave comes in the fall that experts talk about, what happens, right? And can people put the dampener back on and slow down?
I think this is a good, I hate to say practice run, because that trivializes it, but it is kind of a practice run for what happens next, one way or the other.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's, I think kind of this thread that we're discussing here about, real life intersecting with our industry and how it impacts it. Yeah. Trying to find a really good way to segue into something interesting that we saw over the last week or so, even from a construction perspective, which was this incredible furor and uproar and momentum down south by Black Lives Matter, and in response to Mr. Floyd's passing at the hands of the Minneapolis police. It was, I'm sure there in BC, just as we saw here in Ontario, there was an uproar inside the industry and out, right?
Yeah, there was.
Yeah, and
there were certainly demonstrations, and all of them safe. There's no, and Tom, let's be honest here, there wasn't that much rioting, quote unquote, from actual protesters in the States either. It's been found that was a lot of outside people getting in and taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah, which is always the case. And I know we discussed it in kind of off the record, but, even having covered the G20 riots here in Toronto when I was there, covering the G20, it was clearly evident. It wasn't the peaceful protesters, really. At that time, it was just like the ne'er-do-wells who kind of took advantage of the situation, really blew it up and blew it apart, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And we saw that with this as well. But the reason to bring it up is for those of you that have been following our new Instagram account, and thank you for that, and the likes and the shares. Once again, on Instagram, you can just find us by typing in the construction record, all one word. Our Awesome 8 post that we have, which is now going to be a recurring segment here on the podcast, where we talk about kind of there's a lot of great material on Instagram. People either sharing stuff from their projects, initiatives, or just kind of putting up inspirational quotes. And we try to highlight those in the Awesome 8. We pick the 8 best that we've seen over the last week, since the last time we posted about the Awesome 8. And in particular for this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about the Awesome 8 that we recognized last week, which had everything to do with the Blackout Tuesday initiative on social media, right? It was interesting to see, for us, the stakeholders in the industry that took advantage of that opportunity to express, their thoughts on where things stand around equality, inclusion, discrimination, racism. Because Warren, you and I have been covering this industry long enough to know those fingers get pointed a lot, on sites, right? Whether it's Indigenous folks, whether it's women on the job sites, or Blacks, or Asian. Well, we see that the construction is not immune at all to thoughts of discrimination and racism.
Well, and we've also been to enough events, and we've seen enough change too over the years at the executive level that it used to be, and it still is, but it used to be a lot more white, old, and male, and there has definitely been a shift I've seen as I've gone through conferences over the years, but it's not anywhere near where it could be. That's for sure.
No, for sure, exactly, and so it was kind of great to see some. It was great to see some folks get mobilized for the Blackout Tuesday event, where they put up either just a black swatch on their social media post for that day, or in the days before and after, people putting out messages of support and of their stance. And I just thought maybe for our listeners today, for those who didn't see some of this stuff on Instagram, I'll just speak from what I saw on Instagram, via social media. Some of the messages that were posted by some of the stakeholders in construction. For instance, EllisDon on Tuesday posted this statement. EllisDon stands in solidarity with all those fighting against social injustice and racism. We are committed to inclusive diversity and believe everyone has a right to live and work in an environment free of discrimination. We have a platform, and we have the responsibility to our employees, partners, clients, and community to speak up for the Black community. And we will. # Black Lives Matter. Strong message from one of the biggest GCs in Canada.
Yeah.
And
from a CEO who doesn't hold back in his opinions either.
No, exactly. And I think we can categorically and safely say EllisDon has been one of the more progressive employers in construction in the time that they've changed with the times, whether it's been technology or communication, but also they do have a really healthy work culture that's inclusive and innovative. We've seen it. We actually have one of our former staffers from the Daily Commercial News, Andre Wajaja.
That's true.
Who now works at EllisDon, and he said it's like the proof is. He's like, it's real. They do what they preach. When I asked him how it was there, and so impressive to see EllisDon. Countless firms put up just the simple black swatch. So credit to a lot of those who did that. And other folks just put up small messages, like Turner Fleischer just simply put, overlaid on their black swatch post was, "Together we can do better." Simple message, right? To the point, showing their thought. Kinsole Timber. We are pausing this week in solidarity to make space for compassionate listening and the voices of people of color. And I know we've talked about how the union movement, and we saw this in some of the posts on social media, whether it was Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, the union movement, which is based on a lot of equality and was pivotal during those heavy years of civil kind of debate in the States and in Canada in the 50s and 60s.
Definitely,
mobilized as well, right?
Well, out here we had BC Building Trades, Andrew Mercier, the executive director, put out a statement. It's a fairly long statement, so I don't know if I'll read the whole thing, but it basically voiced support not just for Black people, but for Indigenous workers and Asians who are facing discrimination for any reason, but specifically now because of COVID-19, and Muslims have been targeted by white people, which has been happening since 9/11. So he just said, this is, we can do better and we have to do better. And also Construction Rehab, which is a mental health service and substance use service for the BC Building Trades and CLRA. They put out a Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter tweet as well. I didn't see that much because I went through a whole bunch of different, by no means comprehensive, but I did go through quite a few Western associations, and I didn't see as much as I think there was happening on the East.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. Via Instagram, it was kind of an interesting mix I found across Canada in the network that we have built, right? So you're coming across the stuff that comes in your feed.
That's true. Yeah, it's inherently kind of biased in that I'm seeing more of what is coming to me in the first place as opposed to what all's out there.
Exactly. So I guess we say that as a caveat to the folks that did mobilize. If we didn't see your message, you know what I mean? Apologies. We're not.
And there's about a million different platforms, so it's tough to keep on top of all this stuff.
Exactly. But so we're just picking the ones that came across in our network and our feed that caught our eye. And from the LiUNA Canada, the big labor union, had a post that said, "In this house, we will continue to fight for economic, social, and racial justice." And that was kind of put together over just a symbol of a home on their post. Strong, simple messaging, right? And it was interesting to see people kind of just get mobilized for that day, and we did as well. You know what I mean? That's how we as a company and as newspapers, we wanted to show that we support, any initiative that's going to improve equality, eliminate racism, bring some fairness to job sites and just in general to life. You know what I mean? I know we're supposed to be unbiased as publications, but
I don't think there's any bias there, really.
Yeah, exactly. It's what we believe as our values, our core values as Construct Connect, as the Daily Commercial.
It's in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I don't think we're treading anything here.
Yeah, exactly. We are just doing what's right by saying we stand with you, and we were proud. We were proud to see the people in this industry that took a step up. You know what I mean? So maybe some people don't put up social media posts, but are very active behind the scenes, and we believe that too, and we know that happens. So to all of you, kudos. But we thought it was worthwhile to kind of mention in the podcast, right? That we kind of saw what you were doing, and hopefully you continue, practicing what you preach, right? So, and on that front, around inclusion and equality, we have later this month our National Women in Construction feature that's going to be running in the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. And I can say the stories from west to east, once again this year, are really interesting, whether they're profiles of folks or initiatives. The feedback we get on this feature kind of confirms, I don't want to say confirmation bias, but it confirms what we've suspected and what we've seen. And you kind of alluded to this too. We've been seeing change in this industry. Yeah, it's not just old white guys. Right? So, and we're seeing this comprehensive thought and initiative over the last 5 years to really increase women's participation in construction. And
and I think part of that is we saw, for maybe not in the last little while, but for several conferences back, you'd see a lot of succession planning stuff. Well, I think that's happened now, right? So there is a new generation, and it is going to be not as white bread as it used to be, or male for that matter.
Well, it's true, and that's actually kind of the thread of one of the topics I talk in the upcoming feature interview with Sean Reid of Arrowhead Coaching and Facilitation Management. Sean is a former Daily Commercial News editorial advisory board member. He's the former head of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada Ontario chapter. And part of what we talked about was, the general talk that we had was about, an op-ed in response to a Jim Balsillie op-ed that said, hey, Canada, invest your money in tech. Don't invest your stimulus dollars in construction. That's an old way of doing things.
Okay. What did you say, Dave?
That was.
I'll just check my BlackBerry for an update on. Oh, wait a minute.
Exactly. How did that work out for you? So Jim wrote that, and it ran in the National Post. Now, Sean, for background for listeners that will listen to, and we touch upon his history as well in the interview, Sean, he spent 10 years at PCA, helping launch their Ontario chapter here. And before that, 10 years here that he spent in construction in Ontario, he was 10 years in the tech sector. So he's lived in both worlds. And when he saw that op-ed by Balsillie, he felt like he needed to write something. And I thought he was the right person to pen something like that, because he's lived in both worlds, showing that construction and tech can be allies, especially when it comes to the investment in both. And to the point, as we explored that, we talked about the future of construction and the changing demographics and what's, you know what I mean, how leadership is changing and what's expected of construction in the future. He touched upon that a bit on the record and off the record. Mm-hmm. So I hope our listeners enjoy the feature interview. If anyone has any feedback, by all means, please email us or respond to one of our posts. And if anybody has any ideas for any op-eds or featured guests, please reach out to us at editor@dailycommercialnews.com or editor@journalofcommerce.com. With that, do you have anything else, Warren, for the listeners?
No, I think we covered it. I've smack talked BlackBerry, and that's pretty much the top of my career, really.
Perfect. And with that, we'll segue to the Sean interview. Thank you, everyone.
The Construction Record is brought to you by the BC Construction Safety Alliance. Through programs, services, training, and consultations, the BCCSA is making safety simpler. Find out more at bccsa.ca.
Hello, everyone. Vince Versace here, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today. With me, our featured interview guest is Sean Reid. He's President and Head Coach at Arrowhead Coaching and Facilitation Solutions. For those of you from Ontario in particular, you'll be familiar with Sean. Before starting his endeavors at Arrowhead, he was with the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada, Ontario, as the Ontario head and representative. Sean wrote an op-ed, which was published in the DCN on yesterday, which with the headline, "Construction is an ally of Canadian tech, not an enemy." And this op-ed, we're going to explore some of the points that Sean talked about, because it's in response to something Jim Balsillie, those of you that are familiar with Canadian tech and the history of the BlackBerry and RIM. Jim chairs the Council of Canadian Innovators, and he recently wrote a column in the National Post. And I'm going to start off with this one particular paragraph from what Jim wrote, and then we'll kick off our conversation with Sean. Jim wrote, "Using a traditional shovel-ready physical infrastructure lens, whether roads, bridges, or hockey rinks, to stimulate demand and drive productivity has no traction in a 21st century global economy, where intellectual property and data are the most valuable business and national security assets." So kind of there you see Mr. Balsillie's pitting tech versus construction and infrastructure, and that's where it turns our eyes and ears. So I'm going to start off our conversation with Sean. Sean, is construction in fact an ally of Canadian tech or an enemy?
Well, first of all, Vince, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And I think, well, the answer unequivocally is yes, construction is a huge ally for Canadian tech and vice versa. And I don't fault Mr. Balsillie for his impassioned plea that government would focus on tech in the future rounds of stimulus coming down the pipe. Tech is in Canada, it has not been stronger than it is right now since the days of Nortel and Jim Balsillie's own Research in Motion. And we are at another, with this COVID recovery and the new normal that's setting in, tech is at an unbelievable opportunity, particularly Canadian tech with the likes of Shopify and other giants leading the way. There's an enormous opportunity for Canadian tech to make leaps and bounds. So I don't fault him for putting an impassioned pitch forward for Canadian tech. The problem is, I think, when you pit one industry against another, and particularly in this case to suggest that that construction and our investments in construction are somehow ill-advised as a strategy for recovery. This is where I think, and this is certainly the focus of my op-ed, and certainly I think where more progressive policy minds should move is towards actually seeing these construction and tech as two parts of the essential puzzle. Construction and tech have been wonderful allies over the years. Both in terms of construction serving as a market for tech, but also construction also building much of the tech infrastructure that supports the tech industry in Canada today. So the focus of my op-ed was, let's not fall into the trap of pitting one industry against another in this stimulus recovery. Let's find ways to actually lift all boats.
And I find you bring an interesting perspective to this because of your background as well. Before your 10 years at PCA, you were also involved in the tech industry.
I did. I worked for a company called Cognos, which is a business analytics software company, for 10 years. So I appreciate, and frankly, our software was used in construction firms and related industries around the globe. So I saw firsthand how these two industries work together. So yes, I speak as somebody who is actually a great lover of both the tech industry and the construction industry.
For sure. In our current state of affairs, and you explore this thread in your op-ed too, is we're still in this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and post-pandemic world is going to necessitate a lot of change, most likely, right? Especially in the built environment. That's something our industry is exploring. Mm-hmm. And there will have to be that marriage, or at least that working relationship between tech and construction to kind of build out that post-COVID, economy, let alone working space, right? Mm-hmm. That there's opportunities for both to work hand in hand.
Absolutely. And I think this is where the kind of the punchline of my op-ed was actually a call to action for the construction policy advocates and in our industry, of whom, as you said before, I was a part before my new venture here. And that call to action was, to engage policymakers at all levels in helping them see that thread, that combination, that coming together of technological innovation and construction. So we don't need to go back with the same ideas about what infrastructure stimulus should look like, but we should go back but we can go back with an infrastructure ask. But I think to meet Mr. Balsillie and his stakeholders in the middle is to say, let's do it differently this time. Let's actually embrace a level of technological innovation and automation that perhaps wasn't as present the last time we had to go through this.
For sure. And we've seen at times this industry, the advocates, the proponents of construction, mobilize into some tech space or tech ideas and projects, in particular like Sidewalks Labs, concept that was floated here in Toronto, correct?
Absolutely. Sidewalk Labs is a great example of, there were many times in my advocacy work at PCA where I would go and see other construction stakeholders and colleagues, representing not only their interests, but actually championing Sidewalk Labs, because we saw that it was going to be a massive opportunity and a massive win for both tech and construction. And that's just one example, and it didn't obviously work out, but I think the lesson from there is that construction can be a strong ally for tech, and construction wants to see this kind of innovation and infrastructure, and so I think that was a great example of proof that these industries are allies and can position themselves as such to policymakers at all levels.
Well, thank you for that, Sean. I think it's interesting perspective for people in construction and in the tech industry to keep in mind as far as the marriage between both sectors going forward. And I think you really touched upon it quite well in your op-ed. But I'm going to switch gears a bit since I do have you here. You did wrap up your career at PCA and moved on to your new venture here at Arrowhead. And I'd be remiss not to ask you about maybe, some kind of reflective thoughts on your time at PCA, maybe accomplishments, that happened here in Ontario? Things that you were proud of, what you did, and what you learned during that decade of doing that work.
Well, I mean, so that's, yeah. So I would say there were three, main, both successes slash, takeaways from it. I mean, first, obviously, I'm thankful for the work that we did. We started the organization with an advocacy agenda that had really three pillars, to it. One was to lower apprenticeship ratios. One was to, and a part of that, and just restructure the apprenticeship system in a way that was more open. One was to change or halt the further expansion of compulsory trade certification. And the third, of course, was to see open tendering restored in Ontario municipalities. So, over the course of 10 years, after lots of ups and downs, we accomplished most of that. So I'm certainly grateful for that. I'm extremely grateful for the work that my successor, Karen Renkema, put in all those years with me through all of that, and much of that success belongs, the credit for that belongs to her. But yeah, so that certainly on the advocacy front, that's I'm pleased with what we accomplished there. I'm also, this is a little bit of inside baseball for PCA, but I'm also very pleased with what we did operationally within PCA, both within the Eastern Canadian operations that I was directly responsible for, but also nationally. We about 2 or 3 years into my journey with PCA, we actually substantially transformed the way that our operational systems, the way we manage performance and plan and executed performance in our organization, the way that worked. And we brought in a new system that really made an impact on the focus of our organization and the growth of our organization, like almost doubled the revenue of the organization over the course of 3 years largely because of that system that we brought in. So I'm actually quite proud of the kind of association management system that we brought in into the organization as well. And I guess the third lesson for me, and I suppose this is a bit of a mix of regret too, I'll be perfectly honest, is I think one thing about stepping back from the heat of the advocacy arena, is I was somebody who fell prey to, I think, taking some of this stuff a little too personally at times. And I'll be just perfectly honest, I regret some of the relational casualties, let's put it that way, that developed over the intense battles of advocacy battles that went on over those 10 years. So I do regret that a little bit, and I think a lesson learned for me is that this is work, it's not life. And so there are some boundaries that one should be mindful of. And thankfully I've been able to mend a lot of those fences now, but it, that was something I think, especially for younger executives, and there's a lot of turnover in our executive ranks in the association world now. That would be my advice to them, is not to get overly swept up in the personal back and forth, because it's not terribly worth it at the end of the day. There are ways to be effective without doing too much damage to those personal relationships.
Well, I think back to when you came on, and at that point I was just a couple of years into my staff writing career at the Daily Commercial News. And I remember our first meetup, our first lunch, where we talked to kind of sort ourselves out, figure out who each of us is to each other, right? Mm-hmm. And Ontario College of Trades and the ratios, that was the thing that was monstrous at that point, And when you talk about casualties and talk about interpersonal relationships professionally, like I think about some of the stuff that I left on the cutting room floor, not particularly with you, but with other sources. And when it came to some of those stories, some of the stuff where I'd actually call a person back and go, "Are you sure you want to say that?" You sure you want that to be in that piece about ratios? And sometimes people enjoyed having that second shot at it to kind of take a breath. Others reveled in it. So I find it heartening that some of the advice you have for the younger executives, kind of looking forward and how to handle some of these initiatives, because you have your old war dogs, I'll call them, that are of a different ilk, and they enjoy it, they revel in it. That's what we notice it as media covering it. They'll say what's on their mind, and they're going to keep rolling forward. And I always wonder, it's like, well, how are they in their personal life? How do they turn that switch off? But I think more often than not, in some of the casual conversations I've had with stakeholders like you, other members of our editorial advisory boards, it's sometimes stuff you can really take home. So is that maybe, it seems like when I look at Arrowhead and what you're doing now, is that some of that personal experience and advice that kind of creeps its way into what you're doing now? Maybe let the listeners know a bit more about Arrowhead. Yeah.
Yeah, so what Arrowhead's focused on is really helping leaders build healthy and high-performing organizations. And I would say, one of the experiences I had both in the association world and in the construction world more broadly is we have a real diversity of both what I would say are incredibly healthy organizational cultures, both at the industry level and at the corporate level. And we also have unhealthy cultures and environments. And my work now is on helping organizations develop, obviously, those healthy and high performing organizations. But I think for the message that I have for organizations now is there are ways to do this without getting dragged down into the fray. We're not going to. We're in this competition for talent in the construction industry, and this is a lesson that I learned from the tech industry. We are not going to attract that next level, that next wave of talent into this industry unless we change ourselves. It's not up to the people sitting outside of our industry to change in order to come into our industry. We're the ones who have to change. We have to compete for talent. So the onus is on us to be reflective about and honest about the state of our industry and organizational cultures, and ask some serious questions about that. And if we see an opportunity for improvement and for growth, to take that opportunity. And that's what my company is going to be focused on, supporting those companies that want to take that next step in organizational performance, and help them do that.
Perfect. Well, on behalf of the Daily Commercial News team and the Journal of Commerce team, we wish you the best. You were one of our most active editorial advisory board members, always giving us good feedback, holding our feet to the fire too, asking some really good questions, especially during our annual meetings. And you gave us direction and great constructive feedback when we needed it. And I always appreciated our conversations, whether I was interviewing you during my staff writing days, but then as I entered management as well. It was always informative. So I can see how you're going to help some firms going ahead. And I know our team wishes you the best. They're sad to see you go. At the same time, excited for you too.
Well, I think I appreciate that, Vince. I'm not really going. I'm just simply taking a different seat on this construction bus now, but still very much a lover of construction in Ontario and throughout the country, and very much want to. I've been actually thinking a lot about this, and lately, and I really want to be part of the solution of making construction in Canada one of the most attractive industries in which to work. And I believe we can do that if we're ready to be really reflective and ready to change. And that's what I'm looking forward to, working with organizations and leaders who are ready for that change.
Well, we look forward to it. And as always, the DCN, the JOC, and this podcast will be there to report on it and also help bring a light to it too. Thank you so much, Sean, for everything, and good luck.
Thanks, Vince.
This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association. Clean water is everybody's business.